We're going to have a look at finding Moses and the Exodus, and over to David Taylor for this one.
Yeah, just on that writing, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because, in Egypt, the banks of the Nile is full of papyrus plants. So guess what? You're going to use papyrus. If you're in Mesopotamia, the land's completely flat. There's the riverbanks and there's mud everywhere. So, of course, you're going to use clay to make writing, And you're right, it's just that facet, isn't it, of human creativity. I thought what I'd do would go on a detective journey together. Are you okay for that? Yes? Good. So what I thought we'd do is, using the Bible, let's just see whether we can match times between Bible events and what we know of secular history. And I thought we'd try it with Moses. And by the end of this little bit, I hope to show you the face, the mummified remains of the Pharaoh of the Exodus and Moses' mummy.
When you say mummy, do you mean the mummy of Moses?
Nah, not the mummy of Moses. When we go to 1 Kings chapter 6, it says, in the 4th year of Solomon, that it was the 480th anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt. You got that? So the Bible itself tells us how long had elapsed between Solomon and the Exodus itself. And his 4th year was 966 BC. And if you subtract the 480 years, you're going to get 1468 BC. Sorry, 1446 BC. Now, obviously, when you tally up the reigns of kings and the like, if somebody reigns for 14 years, hey, there might be 14 years and 1 day. Somebody reigns for 14 years, it might be 14 years and 11 months. You with me? So you're going to get some slippage along the way. And if we do this again, what I'd love to do is tell you about a very famous eclipse that actually nails down to the exact moment that we can tally Bible chronology together. But that's not for tonight. So, just going forward. If we go to Egyptian history, what we find is that by and large there is the ancient kingdoms, pre-dynastic, very early, oldest of dynasties. And then you come to the Middle Kingdom. And then you come to this intermediary period where there's this strange group called the Hyksos who either invade or come to dominate in Egypt. And then after that you get what's called the New Kingdom. And that's the area that we need to look at, because that's exactly where this date of Solomon is going to situate us. So, the New Kingdom. And then after that, you get the invasions by Babylon and Persia and all that. And then later you get Alexander the Great conquering, and after that you get the Ptolemies and the Cleopatras just before the time of Jesus. But we're going to go back now to the time of the New Kingdom. So if you want to have a little look at the map of Egypt, there's a couple of clues that we can pull from Scripture. And this map, I don't know how well you can see this, but basically you have the incredibly long kingdom of Egypt. So you've got the Delta period at the top, and then you continue going right down, and at the bottom where the river curls around in Upper Egypt, you have Thebes. And Thebes was once the capital of Egypt, but it also had a capital further up near the Delta in Memphis.
Can I just ask, obviously that map, Egypt looks very thin.
Yes.
Is that the kingdom itself?
Yeah, I mean, you can almost see one side of Egypt to the other. I mean, that's an exaggeration. But it only really functions in the middle of the desert on either side of the river.
And that's
so the Nile just cuts right through the whole thousands of miles And Egypt is just literally a city's worth on either side of the bank.
And Egypt's not too much different from that today.
No.
I don't know if anyone's ever been to Egypt. When you fly over it, desert, 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 green, desert, desert. And it's just round the Nile that there's anything alive, isn't it? And if you've been on a trip or something, you get off the Nile, you get on your bus, you travel for a couple of miles, and suddenly there's nothing. And that's what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why papyrus works on. Thousands and thousands of miles of papyrus on either side of the bank. Now, when we start focusing on the children of Israel, when they first go to Egypt, we find that Joseph, it says, is given a priestess, Asenath, the daughter of the high priest of On, in Hierapolis, to marry. I'm sorry, I've got a very bad cold at the moment, and I know I'm not pronouncing things properly, so please forgive me. My head's like cotton wool. But here, Heliopolis, we know that where that is, because it's on the delta, and if you look on the next slide, you'll see it. So that's right up on the delta at the top. You've got the city of Avaris, and then further down the bottom, you've got Heliopolis. Now, Avaris is where the land of Goshen is, and that's where the children of Israel settled. And later, Avaris is called Ramses, which again we'll look at in a moment. But it's quite important to understand that just below Heliopolis, where you see that other black just on the edge of the screen, is actually where Memphis is. Now, why is it important? Well, have you ever read the story of Moses and Pharaoh? Because what type of thing happens? Over and over again, Moses goes to Pharaoh, tells him what God says, goes back to his people. Pharaoh does what he does. Moses has to go back yet again. Now, if the capital of Egypt at that time was in Thebes, it would be months between every visit.
The Exodus would take 40 years just to get to through the place. It would
take 40 years to have the dialogue with Pharaoh going backwards and forwards. So clearly we find that Memphis has to be the place where the capital is. And we know that Joseph was given the daughter of the priest of Heliopolis. So we know that the children of Israel are probably based there, as well as down in Avaris as well. And that's a very short distance backwards and forwards between Memphis. And suddenly the story starts, to my mind at any rate, to really come alive. And then we find that it says in Genesis, they built in Exodus, they built Pithom and Ramses as supply cities for Pharaoh. And then it says, so the Egyptians put slave drivers over them to crush their spirits with hard labor. And then also, it's worth pointing out that, as I say, Ramses is also called Avaris. Now, why does this become important? Well, because Ramses is named after one of the pharaohs.
Which one?
And so, nearly got me. One of the things a lot of people think, oh, well, that means Ramses is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. No, it doesn't at all. And he's far too late. The Exodus happens earlier than that. So I just want to address that question of why the name of the city of a future Pharaoh. Well, think of it like this. If we were talking about St. Cuthbert being carried in his coffin to Durham City, yeah? In our day and age, we would use the modern name for Durham. So if we were talking to anybody, we would say they carried the Cuthbert's coffin off to Durham. But if you talk to people at the time, they wouldn't know what you were talking about because it was called Dunelm. Yeah?
Like the mill.
In the same way that Newcastle, we talk about Newcastle, but nobody knows where it used to be called before the Newcastle was built. They know it's called Pontelius in Roman times, but nobody knows what it was called in medieval times. Jordanium. So, the fact that when they're writing in the book of Exodus, or the later editor uses the title of Ramses for the city name, that's because the readers at that time would have recognized what the name was. Okay, so let's move.
So the city was known as Avaris when the Exodus happened.
Yes.
And in later history, when they're writing, it's called Ramses.
Correct.
Okay.
So we've got some fascinating things from archaeology that we pull up. So, for example, if you want to see some Semitic slaves making bricks that the Pharaoh demanded, I've got a picture for you. And you can see that they are clearly Semitic. It's interesting.
Are they the ones who are paler than the other ones? Or is that not?
No,
not part of it.
Yeah, I think they did try to show the overseers in a different light.
Right.
But there's a lot of debate about the racial profile of the Egyptians of the time, and there's nothing to suggest, actually, although I know it's almost a heresy to say nowadays, but there's no evidence that the Egyptians really were black. So just for the record, did you watch the thing on, I think it was Netflix, on Cleopatra, where the start at the very beginning, and the professor says, "There's no evidence that Cleopatra was black, but my grandmother says she was, so I believe it." And that was the whole of the background on that. Anyway,
so this is from the time showing the Israelites making bricks.
And there's all sorts of other things. I can show you other things later on, but one of the interesting things is, if we're going to go back to find these, who these pharaohs were, what I thought would be interesting to do was to look at one thing that's sometimes missed in the the Exodus account, and just pick up on it, and it tells us something very important, and that is the idea of the defeated Egyptian gods. So let me try and tell you what I mean. So it says, for example, in Exodus 12:12, "For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment." Have you got that? So God says he's not only making judgment against the Egyptians, but he's actually going to do it upon the Egyptian gods. And it says, "The Egyptians were burying all their firstborn whom the Lord had struck down. The Lord had also executed judgment on their gods." Right? So what I want you to understand is that the 10 plagues that come are actually warfare, not just judgments on the people, but it's warfare against the gods of the Egyptians. And each plague was designed to disarm one of the gods of the Egyptians in the Egyptian pantheon. And I can't spend too long on it, because honestly, you know what I'm like. You could wind me up, we'll be here in 4 hours and I'd still be talking about it. So
it's true.
I will go through. But the water turns to blood. There's frogs, there's lice, there's flies, there's livestock, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the killing of the firstborn. And that's interesting, because if you look at the gods of the Egyptians, you get these. Oops.
They put a background on that one.
I didn't put a background on, sorry about that. But basically, if you look at Heket, the second one along, she is a god with the head of a frog. The first one is the Nile, the flooding of the Nile. So the Nile is poisoned, if you like. That's the first one gone. The plague of frogs. You know? And if you go through each of them, the livestock, the darkness, each one in turn until you come to Anubis, the god of death. The Ra, the sun god, and it goes black. Yeah? And you come to Anubis and the god of death. And suddenly you find that the judgment is incurred upon the Egyptian gods. So it's going to become important.
Does each one of the plagues represent one of those?
Yes.
Okay.
You can track right through. But what I thought you might know about and might find really interesting is there is a papyrus called the Ipuwer papyrus. And Ipuwer papyrus. And the Ipuwer papyrus is written by a guy called Ipuwer, and he's bemoaning having to live through terrible times. Now, this is one of those classic cases where it so matches the biblical account that it's almost impossible to discount it. But if you do talk to Egyptologists and archaeologists who are non-believers, they will give all sorts of arguments against it. So all I want to do really is point this out to you so that you can see it for yourselves.
Sorry, continue. Yeah.
Sorry?
Continue, sorry.
So, on the scroll, 2:5-6 says, "Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. Men shrink from tasting. Human beings and thirst after water." On the third, it says, "This is our water, this is our happiness. What shall we do in respect of all that is ruin?" So you can see how that matches the first plague. And then it says, "Gates, walls, and columns are consumed by fire. Lo, Egypt weeps. The entire palace is without its revenues. There isn't any wheat or barley or fish. Grains perished on every hand. The land is given over to weariness and the cutting of flax. All animals, their hearts weep. Cattle mourn. Behold, the cattle are left astray. There's none to gather them together. The land is without light."
The land is without light.
Yep. "Forsooth, the children of princes are dashed against the walls. The children of princes are cast out in the street. The prisons are ruined. There's groaning throughout the land, mixed with lamentations." And then it says, "Behold, the fire has mounted up on high, and its burning goes forth against the enemies of the land." And of course, in Exodus, it talks about the pillar of cloud to lead the way and the pillar of fire by night. But this is Egyptian, of course, speaking against that. Now,
so this papyrus,
yeah.
Is this just some obscure thing that we'll never see? Or is this...
No. This is very well known.
So where could we go see this?
I don't know where it is.
Okay.
I presume it's in Cairo Museum, but I don't know. I'll check
the
it out.
Ipuwer papyrus.
Yeah.
But that's worth something worth researching. Just in case anybody wants to corroborate what's being said there, that is, it exists. It's findable.
There's loads on it. Absolutely loads. But there's one other thing in it that I thought was absolutely fascinating. He says this: "Gold and lapis lazuli, silver and malachite, carnelian and bronze are fastened on the necks of the female slaves." You got that? And of course, in Exodus it tells us that they requested from the Egyptians silver and gold articles. So actually, they used to dress their female slaves in jewelry. So it was part of the status to dress your female slave up in all this jewelry. Because it always seemed very strange, isn't it, that they're taking all this jewelry off the Egyptians. Yeah?
Yeah, it's almost like they did a raid before they left. But
it's not. It's the custom and practice of the Egyptians.
Right. But does it not say that they plundered the Egyptians?
Yes, but if you think because they walked off with it all, that's a pretty good plunder, isn't it?
I guess it wasn't given to them when they were slaves. It was on a bit of a loan.
Yeah, but the other thing is the type of work that would be given when people were making bricks and building. It was more indentured labour than the way you think of slaves. These weren't kept in chains. There were whole cities where they had their own commerce and time off, and but they were indentured labourers, if you like. So what I want to do is take that idea of the death of the Egyptian gods, and we're going to go on this journey now to find the Pharaoh. So bear with me. Are you doing okay? Yep. Bang on.
Oh, put the next slide up. Go, Joanne.
And that is a statue of Akhenaten from the Aten Temple in Karnak. And Akhenaten is unique because he was the only pharaoh to abandon the gods of Egypt. He abandoned the worship of all the gods, and he worshipped just one, the sun, that they'd never worshipped before other than in the form of Ra. But he didn't do it as Ra, if you're with me. And it's interesting because there is an inscription. If you go to the next slide, there's an inscription at Karnak that records a speech by Akhenaten. And he says, "The temples of the gods are fallen to ruin. Their bodies do not endure." So why did he adopt this worship of... some people trying the wrong, but some people have tried to say, oh, maybe he was the forerunner of Moses, because he worshipped one God.
They've tried to say he invented monotheism.
Yeah, he didn't.
No.
All his gods were dead.
Yeah.
They were defeated. And the only thing he was left to worship was the sun. Yeah? So we can identify that he is...
Isn't it funny they chose the sun? It's one of those weird coincidences, eh?
So the next slide, there's a relief on Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, seated with their three daughters under the rays of Aten being the name that they give the sun. So he doesn't even use the word Ra, because Ra was one of the old gods. And that's at the Berlin Museum. And that is his, next one, please, is his skull. That was photographed in 1912 by Elliot Smith, very famous Egyptologist. He does have a funny-shaped head. The statue seems to suggest that as well. But because he's got a funny-shaped head, you can guess what that means, can't you?
Oh, I can will it hazard a guess what some people say.
Yeah, the ufologists say he was an alien.
Yeah.
But yeah. You can almost predict it, can't you? Now, he may have had. I'm struggling here. I don't think his mummy's preserved. It may be. If it is, it's included in the next slide or two. But just to go back to this, it was during the reign of Akhenaten that they found, or rather, they've since found, that there were letters to Akhenaten from the people who lived in Canaan. Have you got that? And they were writing to Akhenaten, and they were saying, we need help. We've been overrun by this new army that's arrived called the Hebrew.
Did they come out with the wilderness by any chance?
They came out the wilderness. And there's 12 places, there's 12 letters, and some of these are in the British Museum. You can see them if you want. And in each of these, it names places that we have matched in the Bible of where the children of Israel fought and won the battles. So the people in Canaan are writing to Akhenaten. So guess what? We can date Akhenaten to exactly the time of the conquest.
40 years after the Exodus.
40 years after the Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
So we've now come to the end of the line because we know who Akhenaten is. We know why he hasn't got the gods that he used to, his people had. And what's more, we can actually see the letters that were written and even read them. And so the Hebrew are invading. Can you go to that slide, please? So the location of something called Tel Amarna, that's it. So bang between Memphis down to Thebes was a place called Tel Amarna, and that is where they discovered tens of thousands of cuneiform clay tablets, and totally exciting cache of documents. And if you look at them, if you keep going, please.
There's some pictures of them there.
You'll find pictures of the tablets on display in the British Museum and also in the Louvre.
So are these the letters that say
The Hebrew are attacking and we need help.
help, we're being attacked, someone's coming
Yeah.
to get us? And you can see those in the British Museum.
Yeah. That one is that letter, next one. That's letter 161, and it's from a guy called Azuru, who's the leader of the Amuru, which is the Amorites. And if we go again, please, you can even, oh, you're not going to be able to see it, I guess. But if you want to have a look at this, I can make sure you've got a look at it if you want. So basically, you've got...
The bigger one has the list.
The bigger
next
ones
one
might be
has
better.
the full list on there.
Next one, please.
That's it.
Yeah. So there's actually there's 12 places mentioned in the letters, and I've got a complete match down of the biblical verse where those places are mentioned as where we were fighting. So, not being funny, you've got the names of the places mentioned, complain about a conquest by the Hebrew, and the same place names matching the biblical account. Well, I think that's a done deal, that one, isn't it?
I think it seems...
It's very hard to argue against that particular thing.
Microphone.
So he was the Pharaoh
Akhenaten.
that
They were writing to him
so
to say, send your chariots because we're being conquered.
so he was the Pharaoh that released the
No,
He wasn't.
he is the last of the pharaohs that we're looking at.
He's 40 years after, so he's at the time of moving into the land of Israel.
And then if you go to the next one, really important, what you find here is there's a small clay tablet found in 2009 by Elliot Mazar. I had somebody I know who worked with Mazar, and it was the excavations in Jerusalem's awful, and it was an archival copy of part of the Amarna correspondence. And for whatever reason, it shows evidence that it was burned in a fire. And of course, in Judges 1:8, it says towards the end of the conquest, the children of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it and smote it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Of course, fire is the biggest asset for archaeology because it's the destruction layers where you find the riches of history. That's where you find things. So this little tablet here is actually part of the evidence from Jerusalem itself that matches the Tel Amarna cuneiform tablets and matches up, and it was found in 2009.
Okay. I'm going to have to speed you up a little bit, if that's okay.
Yes. Okay, let's go back then. So we've got Akhenaten. You're going to have to keep up on if you don't mind, guys.
Going back from Akhenaten. So we're going to go
Roll back,
backwards
please.
from Akhenaten. Okay, right.
Yeah. Can you roll back, please?
Back where? Sorry.
The next slide, please. Yeah, you're going to have to keep nimble-fingered. That's correct. So we've actually got the dates for Akhenaten. And then if we go before him, or rather, there is the statue that I've mentioned. And if we go before him, we come to Amenhotep III, and he is the Pharaoh of Israel's wilderness years. He reigns for 40 years, and he is the guy...
He reigns for 40 years.
He does.
Up to the end of it. So
Before Akhenaten.
he takes over at the start of the wilderness years, as if the
Yes.
last Pharaoh
Yes.
something's happened to him.
You'll come to
Okay,
that. You'll
okay.
come to
I'm
that
trying to
more.
get ahead.
So Amenhotep the third is the Pharaoh of the wilderness years. And if we go, there's his mummified head that is on display. Yeah, I tell you what, he looks in better nick than me. If we go before him, we come to a guy called Thutmose IV. Now, what's interesting about Thutmose IV is he was never expected to rule because he was the second son. So why did he come to rule?
Firstborn.
Because the firstborn died. He was the spare. He only reigned for 9 years. So if you're thinking about Akhenaten, then the one before him for 40 years, and then this 9 year.
Mhm.
So the
A bit of
overlap
leeway.
there. So
Yeah.
the reign of the one for 40 years starts a little bit into the wilderness years.
Yeah.
And then Akhenaten comes after that. And then if we go before him, or rather that's the mummy of Thutmose the fourth. If we come into Amenhotep II, this is the guy who, that's a statue that's in the Brooklyn Museum, but this is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And Amenhotep II, that's a steely boasting of his conquests. It's interesting, when you lose a battle and you're an Egyptian, you claim it's a victory. Because no one's going to criticize you, because nobody knows. Your army comes back from where they've been fighting, and you go, "Yeah, guys, we won!" And all the people go, "Yay, we won!" And they wonder why you don't come back with an army.
So that's the stone tablet there. That's
Yeah,
claiming
sure.
victory on something.
Indeed.
Okay.
And that is the mummy of the Pharaoh of the Exodus coming up next. And that is Amenhotep II. And if we go before him,
Isn't it weird looking at the face of someone?
who you've
the
read
Bible.
about for years and years,
Not a picture, but the face.
the actual face. And Thutmose III was before him. He was the Pharaoh who reigned while Moses was in Midian. Thutmose III, and there's his statue in the Luxor Museum. And the mummified head of Thutmose III, who grew up with Moses.
So he'd have been not brothers, but they'd have been grew up as brothers. in
Yeah,
a sense.
and importantly, you come next to somebody it has to be mentioned. So, please, yeah. So we come to Hatshepsut, and she was probably 10-year-old when she saved Moses from the River Nile. Now, what's interesting about her, we know an awful lot about her. And although she was the Pharaoh's daughter, when her father died, the next one that should have reigned was just a baby. And she became co-ruler and then regent. And so, very, very important woman.
What's interesting about her? I'm sorry, I'm jumping in. You're probably going to say this. We went to her temple,
Yeah.
and all of the engravings of her, all of her face on her statues had been removed.
Yes.
Like Egypt was embarrassed about her and
they
wanted
were-
to strike her from the record.
Because, well, what I'll say is, if you want more of this, I think in history we can now locate who Moses was. And I think we can give him his first Egyptian name, and the circumstance of his rise to power, and how much power he had in Egypt for the first 40 years. And also, to bracket that, we can go probably further to find a statue dating from hundreds of years earlier that may well be Joseph.
Wow.
We might do that one
So-
next time.
If you're interested. I was going to try and cram all sorts
Yeah,
in,
we'll
but I
not do
couldn't
that now,
tonight.
but we'll move
But-
on now.
Yeah. But if you want to just hit the next one, sorry, go back.
Back another one?
Yeah, I think back another one.
That's Hatshepsut.
That's
Okay,
my-
Moses and Mummy. Oh, I ruined that joke earlier.
You did ruin the
Yeah.
joke. I thought I'd just point out
I'm glad I
that
did.
I set that up and you blew it out the water.
I did. I'm sorry.
Thanks very much.
And I thought what may be helpful to do is just discuss these different time periods that you get in Egyptian history. And there's a very famous one called the New Kingdom, and that's what we looked at last time. And you've got to say, well, why is it called the New Kingdom? And the reason is that something had happened in Egypt. You'd had a group of people had taken over inside Lower Egypt, so the bit near the Mediterranean coast. And if you remember from maps that we've looked at previously, Egypt, huge, long, winding country, just basically a mile or so either side of the river.
Can I just
of the Nile.
jump in for 1 second? Just when we talk about Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, sometimes we think that means Upper Egypt is north and Lower Egypt is south. That would make sense to us, wouldn't it? But that's not how it works with Egypt, is it?
No, well, it's the direction that the river travels. So the lower, the river flows to the sea, and so that's called Lower Egypt. So if you look at the bit of Egypt that's towards the Nile Delta, that is Lower Egypt. And what had happened is a group of people had taken over, and they were called Hyksos. And we know from Egyptian history that they were probably from the Canaan area. And we have pictures of them. I showed you some last time of them in stripy coats, and they've got a different hairstyle. They're like sheep, and the Egyptians said that shepherds are an abomination. They wouldn't go near a sheep. Yeah. So the question is, of course, where this Hyksos came from. And I started to give a little bit of a hint last time that maybe they were actually the children of Israel. Because they arrive, obviously, when the famine starts, and they arrive in a goodly number. If you remember, we talked about Abraham having 381 fighting men in his army, if you like. 318, thank you. You keep me right. So 318 fighting men, and obviously if you imagine 318 fighting men, you've probably got at least 318 women, and then you've probably got children on top of that, and then you've probably got other types of workers around that as well. So, you know, at the time of Abraham, he might have had 1,000 people.
It's funny, isn't it? Because you picture Abraham, you picture Isaac, you picture as a small family in a tent.
Yeah, it's not
And
like that.
It's a much bigger, bigger family than that.
It's a city that moves around. And of course, they were so big that the land wasn't able to bear the weight of him and Lot, because Lot had probably an equal size group of men as well. So if by the time of Abraham there was, let's say, 1,000 in Abraham's tribe, and that might be conservative, by the time that Isaac comes along, you'd expect it to be bigger. By the time that Jacob comes along, you would expect that to be bigger. And by the time of the 12 sons of Jacob, you would expect that to be bigger. So by the time that Joseph is in Egypt, there could be quite a significant number of people belonging to those children of Israel. When the famine comes, and they go, and you know the story of Joseph, eventually, of course, Pharaoh says, come and bring everybody, you and your servants. Bring everybody over. So imagine if you've got, I don't know, let's be, again, conservative. Let's suppose you've got 2,000 people.
So it's 370 came down.
Yeah, but that doesn't include. But we'll pick that up. So no, that's cool. So the amount of people that went there, and then they're there for 400 years. how many people can grow from that number of people who, if they're especially vigorously fertile, and they live in doing a job that the Egyptians don't want to do, and then suddenly you can look, and within 4 centuries by certain, you could have ended up more or less taken over. So the question has always been, were the Hyksos an invading army that we don't know about and don't know where they came from, or were they essentially the children of Israel that had grown so large? And it's interesting because when you get into this new kingdom, it's called the new kingdom because you get a pharaoh called Thutmose who goes against these Semitic people in northern Egypt. He dies in battle, and then his brother Amos I completes the conquest, and at that point in time, the Egyptians regain, if you like, all of the land, and they base their capital in Lower Egypt, in Memphis. The next one who's down from Thutmose, his brother completes the conquest, but you get Thutmose I. And it's interesting because it talks about a pharaoh coming along who does not know Joseph. Yep. And of course, at this point in time, the children of Israel are subjugated. So the children of Israel are in captivity, which actually, if you think about it, would make sense if they were the Hyksos. You with me? Because they wouldn't have killed everybody, but they enslaved them. And that actually fits, again, the narrative that we find. So I'll go through a couple of people because they become very important. Now, Thutmose I, have we had his picture yet? Do we have? Okay. Thutmose had a daughter, Hatshepsut. No, that's Hattie. Hatshepsut. And she was his oldest child. But he also had a son who he called, traditionally, Thutmose II. The only problem was that Thutmose II was sickly and he wasn't expected to live, and the king was on his way out. And so basically to protect him as long as possible, he had Thutmose II marry Hatshepsut. So he married his sister. And he was 2-year-old at the time. And so what happens essentially is that his sister, if you like, then gets the job as being pharaoh. You get it? You see why they might have married them? It was both to protect her position, because if he died when he was young, they didn't want any confusion over line of succession. So by marrying him, and she does, in fact, succeed. And when she succeeds, she becomes essentially a pharaoh. And it's interesting, if you look at her with a beard now, those beards are on a stick. So although it's the woman, she's got the beard on a stick that gives her the rule, if you like. She's in charge. And she becomes the pharaoh. Okay, well, that's quite interesting. Now, she rules for 22 years until the brother comes along, Thutmose III, who's only a child when she takes the throne. So the one she married dies. He's quite sickly, doesn't survive long. But there is another in the dynasty. But she becomes regent and rules. And he is Thutmose III. And so you get a picture. You've got this new kingdom. You've got a subjugated people, a defeated people, and there's no real connection between this new dynasty and the old reason why these people came to be there in the first place. Now, what I'm going to do, and I maybe leave the slides for now, I'll just tell you the story if that's all right, and then we'll look at the slides later on and go through the slides because they'll make a bit more sense at that point. Now, Hatshepsut was the Pharaoh's daughter, but she also was a princess. She also became a pharaoh. Her reign is noted for peace and prosperity, with inscriptions highlighting her empathy towards foreigners. And there's a character who we read of in her history, and his name is Senamut, and he's a commoner, and he rises to high ranks underneath her rule. And surprisingly, he's given the most incredible range of titles. He is the royal vizier. He is the chief royal architect. And he's actually the steward to her child, Princess Neferfuri. Now, a lot of people wondered, because a commoner having become the steward for a royal, if you like, is never heard of. So a lot of people originally wondered whether or not it was her lover, and maybe it was his child. But there's no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, it doesn't stand up to the latest discoveries. So he's non-royal in origin, he has many honours, and he rises to prominence. The name Senamut, which means mother's brother, could signify his elevated status. His parents were lowly, and they were Ramos and Hatnofa, who were described as provincial and peasants. And we read that Senamut began to rise under Thutmose I, and he was probably a military leader, and even went down to Ethiopia, rose through the military ranks during Thutmose's campaign in Ethiopia and in Kush. And he becomes a military leader with conquests. You'll see where I'm going in a minute. I won't keep you hanging too long. But the closeness between Senamut and Hatshepsut and her daughter is very well documented. I'll show you some pictures in a few minutes. And Senamut oversaw Hatshepsut's mortuary complex, which again I'll show you, which is an architectural marvel. And then he suddenly disappears. And when he disappears, his own tomb, which has been built, stops. Never finished. And then his name starts being hacked off.
That suggests he didn't die.
Oh no, it does suggest he doesn't die. Otherwise he would have been buried within it with high status. So what is going on? And then later on, after Amenhotep II comes to power, we find that even Queen Hatshepsut's name starts to get hacked off buildings and graffiti everywhere. So she herself loses the prestige that once she had, although she's dead at this point. But very interesting. Okay, let's maybe hit a couple of slides then, if that's the case. So, where are we next? Just where we left off, really.
We were the last one we showed was probably Hatshepsut.
Are you controlling these other desks?
No, desks.
Oh, sorry, I hadn't realised. My apologies. So that is the image of Hatshepsut. It's in the Met Museum in New York. And then if we go to the next one, this is the character of Senamut. And it's an interesting picture. We'll come back to it at the very end. If we can go forward. There we see Senamut with the daughter of Hatshepsut. And he's not just a tutor. If you actually see the next one, you can see, you'll see the status that he's given. If you go to the next slide, please. And, holding the child in a very paternal way clearly a very close relationship. Now, of course, we've said about the timescales. The interesting thing is, if you go back to the birth of Moses, you will find in the story that it is the princess of Egypt that finds the child. Having said that, the sister Miriam, which Mary is actually an Egyptian name, says, I can get the a feeding mother for the child, and we know all that happens. And what's apparent is that timescale-wise, that falls exactly into the timescale for Hatshepsut. There's nobody else mentioned where it looks possible. And the rise of this commoner may well be Moses. So his rise in the palace, which you would expect, he's been brought up by the princess, who now is not just a princess, incidentally. Before very much longer, while he's still probably reaching his teenage years, she now becomes Pharaoh. And he's grown up alongside the person who will be the next Pharaoh. Yeah? The husband that she's married has died, her brother, and she's married again. And he starts to get all sorts of honours. And I'm not saying this is certain, but there's some serious academic work being done at the moment. And even if you look at the names of the parents in the Egyptian account, father is called Ramose, spelled exactly the same as Moses, M-O-S-E, Ramose. And of course the biblical account says, what's the name of the father? Ram. Ram-Oz. And the Hebrew version is Amram. So you can see the overlap there. They're classed as provincial peasants. And of course people had more than one name. And then this idea of did Moses actually fight in the campaign of Thutmose I out in Ethiopia? Well, actually Josephus, the historian, claims that about Moses.
We have a picture of
and
that.
And nobody ever knew where that's supposed to come from.
We have a picture of his victory in Cush as well. I think,
We do have a picture, and so that's Samanut, but also it accounts for the victory that he was involved in Cush. So suddenly it starts to look maybe not just possible, but hey, maybe it's even likely, I don't know. So if he was in fact virtually her child, adopted child, then the idea that he is appointed to be the guardian of her child makes sense, although he's a commoner. And then, of course, even the dates coincide when Senamut vanishes, and it coincides with Moses' flight from Egypt. And what happened afterwards, in terms of striking off the images, is normal practice for when somebody is in disgrace. Hatshepsut, because she adopted him. Moses himself, because he killed the Egyptian, went away and brought the plagues to Egypt that kills the next one in the line, and Amenhotep's own son. And suddenly that looks cohesive, possible. Thank you.
We do have a picture there of Hatshepsut's mortuary complex as well. Just so you said you were going to show that.
Yes, terribly sorry. I said that this is her mortuary complex. I mean, it's an incredible, vast site. It's huge, and if you look at the tomb of or what was going to be Semenut's own tomb, that's the unfinished tomb that you can still visit today.
So we do have a last slide on there where you just ask the question, is that Moses? Could well be the face of Moses there. Fascinating. And of course, thank you for that. So I think that ties in very well with the last time where we looked at the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Obviously, the Pharaoh of the Exodus would be a different Pharaoh to who was Pharaoh when Moses went to Midian, because he's there 40 years. And that's Thutmose III. We do have a picture of Thutmose III a few slides further back from there. Is this the Pharaoh that Moses grew up with? So it may well be that he was the Pharaoh while Moses was in the wilderness.
I guess what I would say is just be very careful. Don't learn your theology or archaeology or Bible history from Disney. Just
Although
because they
Disney-
bring out a movie called Prince of Egypt.
That was DreamWorks, but
Yeah, well,
we'll,
okay.
Having said that, in that movie they do make him the royal architect. Sorry.
Yeah. Don't get it from there.
No, don't get it from there. Don't get it from there. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Can we?